Hello, my name is Colin, and in this episode of Let's Learn Blender, we'll be talking about two of Blender's 3D modeling tools. First, the knife tool. The knife tool is used to let you create custom edges in pretty much any direction on any face of the surface of a mesh that you want. It's a super powerful tool. And the second tool we'll be talking about is called the Bisect Tool, which lets you cut clean through a mesh. And what that means is that you're cutting basically a loop around your mesh wherever you want, and you can even adjust where it is and the angle that cut through the mesh is facing, and you can even use the Bisect tool to remove or chop off part of a mesh and even cut a mesh into two with a few extra steps. So we'll be talking about these two tools in this video. This will be a little bit of a shorter video in this series, so I'll go ahead and put on the bottom of the screen right now how you can help me out by clicking like, subscribe, and the bell icon. Also, if you've not checked out the rest of this video series on YouTube, this is my tutorial series called Let's Learn Blender. I'll put a link to this whole series up on the top of the screen right now, so go ahead and check that out. So, diving into the knife tool in Blender. The knife tool is a tool that you access while you're in edit mode of a 3D mesh object in Blender. So of course, with a mesh object selected, you press Tab to switch from object mode into edit mode. The knife tool is one of the tools along your side toolbar. I'll go ahead and drag the edge of my toolbar to make it a little bit wider so I can see all the tools on the screen now. The knife tool is right here, and if I select it, you will notice that my mouse cursor, if I go ahead and zoom in, is now a little picture of a knife. And all I have to do here is click anywhere on the surface of my mesh object in edit mode to start creating a cut. In other words, an edge that starts with a vertex and runs to another vertex. Now, there are a few things to keep in mind here. If you create a cut on the surface or an edge on the surface of a mesh, an edge can't just end in the middle of a face. So I'm gonna go ahead and click just on an edge, and it'll kind of snap if I'm not exact to that edge. And you can see when I click, it creates a green square, which is a vertex, and I can move my mouse. I'm not holding anything down right now, and I can simply click on another edge, and that creates the beginning of a cut. And now I could keep going, but I'm gonna go ahead and make that edge, that cut permanent simply by pressing the Enter key on my keyboard. When I do that, now of course, if I switch over to my select tool and I'll go into face selection mode, I can select either of those two faces and I can do whatever I want with them. Let's say I could select this face and press the E key on my keyboard to extrude. I could move my mouse and click. Of course, the E key on my keyboard is the extrude tool. And so now I have an extruded face right there. Now, you don't just have to make one cut from edge to edge. The knife tool is a lot more powerful than that. If I go ahead to this other side, I'll orbit and pan over so you can see this side a little bit better. If I use the knife tool again and start on the same kind of upper edge, I can make a zigzag pattern, creating new vertices along my cut in the middle of a face. So I'm going to click down on this edge. Usually you go from edge to edge typically. So I'm going to click, and you can see I can keep going with this cut. Or of course I can press the Enter key on my keyboard or the return key, and that completes that cut. And so now if I go to the selection tool and I go to face select mode and I select either one of these faces, they are in fact faces. Now they are n-gon faces. That means they are faces with more than 3 or 4 sides, but they're still faces. In face select mode, I could tap the E key and extrude. And yeah, you can see I've got a pretty silly looking extrusion or face here extruded out. It is important to note that when you're using the knife tool, you cannot simply cut a hole in the surface of a face. So if I want to create, let's say, a square hole in the middle top of my cube, I could cut from there to there. I'm just clicking now with my knife tool and I'm going to complete this cut. You can see that if I press the Enter key on my keyboard, it doesn't just let me create a face in the middle of another large face. You can't do that in Blender. So it automatically created connections or connecting edges from my middle face out to a couple of corners, just based on what it thought would be best for the faces on the top of my cube. So you can't just have a face in the middle of another face. Something else you can do with a knife tool is you can create new separate cuts before you press enter to finalize the cuts that you've just made. Let's go ahead and see what I mean. If I go back to my knife tool and I create a cut from this corner, if you just click, it'll snap to that corner or to that vertex, and I click on this vertex, well, maybe I want to cut from there to there, but then I want to, let's say, create another cut from here to here. before I press enter on my keyboard to make those two cuts permanent. I can simply do that by pressing the letter E on my keyboard. I'm not sure why it's letter E, it just is, but when you press E, it kind of finalizes that cut, and now I can orbit around and create a new cut here to there. In fact, I'm going to press E on my keyboard again, and I'm going to create a cut from, let's say that bottom corner down here up to there, and I'll tap E and start from here and go to there. And now if I press the enter key on my keyboard, all of those cuts that I just made are finalized. So now I could go ahead to my selection tool and I could select, let's say, that face, and tap E to extrude them out. And maybe I could select this face, and tap E to extrude them out. And I could select this face and tap E and extrude it in. So there's a fairly interesting geometric 3D shape that we've created fairly quickly using different options in the knife tool. Now, the knife tool has, of course, this active tool here on your toolbar, but if you just want to have your selection tool enabled and quickly get to the knife tool, the legacy keyboard shortcut in Blender is the letter K on your keyboard. K is for knife. And the reason I'm showing you this is because the legacy K version of the knife tool has a few more options, and they are listed on the bottom information bar at the bottom of Blender's interface. So you can see down here, I'll go ahead and zoom in, that if you press the enter key on your keyboard, it confirms a cut. If you press the escape key or right mouse button, it cancels your current cut with the knife tool. If you press the left mouse button, it defines or starts a cut. If you double tap the left mouse button, it closes a cut. The E key, as we've covered before, makes a new cut while you're still using the knife tool. Here's a new one. It's the control key. And the control key, if you hold it down, it turns on midpoint snap. And if you let go of the control key on your keyboard, it turns off midpoint snap. What does that mean? Well, I'm going to go ahead and press the control key on my keyboard and hover over the edges of this cube in edit mode. You can see it snaps no matter where I have my mouse cursor, a point to the middle of that edge. So I'm going to go ahead and click there. I'm going to keep holding control and I'll click there, and then I'll press enter on my keyboard, and you can see I've cut the top face of this cube perfectly in half. Let's go ahead and press the K key again to keep going through those little keyboard shortcuts. The control key, of course, is midpoint snap. The shift key will ignore snap. So if you want to create a new point or a vertex near an edge, you see how when I move my mouse cursor, it snaps to an edge? Well, if I don't want that, if I want to make a point that's right near an edge, I can simply hold the shift key on my keyboard, and now it won't snap to an edge. So I can create, a cut that's very near an edge, and I can press enter. Of course, it's not going to let me put an edge in the middle of a face, so it connected both of my ends up to the nearest corners. Okay, pressing K again to go through the rest of those keyboard shortcuts. C is the angle constraint keyboard shortcut. So if I press the letter C on my keyboard, well, I've turned angle constraint on. So if I start making a cut, you can see, I'll just click off to the side, that it's constraining my cuts to 45-degree angles. And these angles are based on my current view in my 3D viewport. So because I'm looking at my scene from a random user perspective view, it's going to cut. And if I cut all the way across my mesh, yes, you can start off the mesh and go across and click. It's going to cut at 45 degrees based on my view, and I can press enter. And if I orbit my scene, you can see, well, now it's no longer at 45 degrees compared to my view, but it was just a moment ago. So if you're going to use the angle constraint option, you might want to go to a top or front or side or bottom view to look at your scene first before you start making that cut. Of course, you can use your number pad keys on your keyboard, or I could press this little -Y button on my little gizmo axes up here to go to my front orthographic view. If you're not in orthographic, you can press this button right here. It toggles between perspective and orthographic. Orthographic means flat. And so now if I press the letter K key on my keyboard, and then I tap the C key to turn on angle constraint, now I can cut directly across and press enter. And I know that edge is flat with my ground because I use angle constraint. The last keyboard shortcut is really powerful. It lets me cut all the way through my mesh. It's the letter Z on my keyboard. If I tap K to go into my knife tool, you can see the Z key is called cut through. And if I tap Z, I can now cut through my mesh and press enter. And you can see if I orbit around, it actually cut all the way through my mesh, including faces that I couldn't see before from that angle. And so now I have a cut a loop cut essentially all the way through my mesh. By the way, if you want to do that with the active knife tool here, that option is called Occlude Geometry. It's turned on by default, so you don't cut through all the way through a mesh. It only cuts the faces you can see. So it ends right there and right there, the cut that I just made. I'm going to go ahead and undo that. If I have Occlude Geometry turned off and I cut all the way through and I press enter, well, you can see now it goes all the way around based on the view or angle of my view that I was at just a moment ago. This knife tool's cut through option, along with the angle constraint option, can be a real lifesaver if you ever run into a problem where you're trying to do a loop cut through a mesh or around a mesh object and you can't because of n-gons. Let me show you what I mean. If I go ahead and press the letter K on my keyboard to go into my knife tool, and I'm going to hold the control key on my keyboard and make a cut across the top of this cube from the middle over here with the control key to the middle over here. I'll go ahead and press enter. I'm going to turn my little cube into a very simple little house. Now, if I want to later add a door to the front of my house here, well, I'm probably going to want to extrude a door inward, a rectangle inward. So I might want to make a loop cut around my house so that I'm forming the top edge of my door. So if I go ahead and press Control R on my keyboard, Control R brings up my loop cut and slide tool. You can see I can hover my mouse over the mesh, and you can see from some directions of this loop cut tool, it goes all the way around the mesh like it should, but in some directions it doesn't. And that's because, I'll go ahead and press escape on my keyboard, that's because I have a face here and a face here that are n-gons. They are faces with more than 4 sides. You can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So this face kind of interrupts loop cuts, because when you make a loop cut around a mesh, it needs to know the exact opposing edge to start at and to go to. And if I make a loop cut from there to there, well, it doesn't know on this face if this cut here should go from that point over to this point or up to this point, because there's no immediate opposing edge, at least as far as it's concerned. So how do I make a loop cut around my house? Well, I could use the knife tool. I'll go back and press escape. I'll go back to my selection tool. I'll press the letter K on my keyboard. I want to make a cut that goes across my house perfectly flat. So actually, I'm going to go to my front view. I'm going to press the little -Y button up here. Actually, I'll go to my side view. So I'll press the letter X here. Now I'm in my right orthographic view. What I want to do here is I want to make a cut all the way through my house, but straight across perfectly. So I'm going to press the letter K to use my knife tool. I'm going to turn on angle constraint with the letter C. I'll tap C, so it's on. I'm going to turn on cut through as well. So I'll tap Z on my keyboard. So now angle constraint and cut through are both on. And so now if I click over here, I can then move my mouse across and click over here. And now if I press enter on my keyboard and zoom out and orbit around, you can see it's made a loop cut essentially all the way around my house. And I could use my selection tool in edge select mode, and I could select, I'll hold Alt on my keyboard and click on an edge there to select the entire edge loop. Alt and click selects an edge loop on an edge. And so now I can use the move tool and move that edge loop down to wherever I want the top of the roof to be. So as you can see, the knife tool can be a great problem-solving tool, especially when you want Blender to make a topology. That means an organization of faces and edges on the surface of a mesh that it's not giving you by default. So that's the knife tool. The second tool I'll be showing you in this video is called the Bisect Tool. And the Bisect Tool is actually a tool on your toolbar. I'll go ahead with this UV sphere selected, and I'll make my toolbar a little bit wider so we can see all the tools. It's actually hiding behind the knife tool here. So if I click and hold on the knife tool icon, and I hold, you can see I have the knife tool and the Bisect tool. And you can tell if I let go on it, that it looks like a tool you can use to chop off part of a mesh. And that's pretty much what it is, except it's a bit more powerful than that. So let's go ahead and check out how you use it. For this, I'm using a UV sphere just to mix things up a little bit. If I use the Bisect tool, what I want to do here is start off the edge of the mesh and click and drag across the mesh. And if I keep holding down, I can adjust where the mesh will be cut across. So if I move my mouse around and then I let go, it's made a cut not just across my mesh where I can see, it's actually made a loop cut essentially around my mesh wherever I to find it, and it's giving me this funny looking little gizmo. This gizmo on my screen, by the way, a gizmo is basically any control in Blender on your screen, lets you move where that cut is. Now, if you go down to this little popover, you can see under the bisect popover that you can adjust its plane. So where it is, you can adjust kind of its location. You can adjust its normal, the plane normal, which is basically its rotation in any of the three axes like that. You can select clear inner or clear outer. Clear outer basically gets rid of the mesh that is where this gizmo arrow is pointing. And you can select clear inner, which will get rid of below where that surface of the arrow is pointing. If you select one of the clear outers or clear inners and also select fill, I'll select clear outer and fill, it will make the new face of the cut into a solid face, an n-gon in this case. So now you can see I've used this tool, the bisect tool, to cut off part of the mesh. Now you're probably thinking to yourself, hey, couldn't you just do this with a knife tool? Yes, you probably could, but probably in a few more steps than with the bisect tool. So this just makes it a little bit easier to do, well, this process. With a knife tool, of course, you could make a cut across the mesh. You could make that cut through all the way through the mesh, and then you could delete part of the mesh and you could fill in the gap on the new side of the mesh. But this just makes it much quicker. With this bisect tool though, you can also cut a mesh into two separate meshes with a few extra steps. So I'll go ahead and do that. I'll press Ctrl Z on my keyboard to get rid of that bisect cut. And I'll use my bisect tool. By the way, if you don't want to use this active tool, you can go up to the mesh menu and it is right here. I believe there is no keyboard shortcut for it though, like the K key for the knife. Bisect doesn't have that. So if I select the bisect tool, it works the same way. I can click and drag and I can let go. And because I already had used this tool and set these two options, it did those for me automatically. Of course, I could adjust, where the normal is. I could adjust the angle of it, I believe, in some way. I believe it starts your cut up here, so it bases the rotation of the plane normal up here instead of in the middle of your cut or mesh object. That's okay. But what I'm going to do here, instead of clearing either the inner or the outer, I'm just going to fill in and create a face in the middle of that new edge loop that's cut all the way through my mesh. And now I'm going to actually select one half or the other. So I'm going to go up to the select menu. I still have that new edge loop selected. I'll go up to the select menu and I'm going to go to select loops. Under select loops, I'm going to select loop inner region. And what I have to do before I do anything else, you can see I was expecting it to select either one half or the other. I actually have to select down here, select bigger, and it'll select I guess it's the bigger half of your mesh object. If you want to separate the other half of the mesh, you could always go up to select and invert. That's up to you. I'm going to select invert again to select that original bigger half. And now if I want to separate this mesh or this part of the mesh into a separate mesh to create two halves where I used my bisect tool, I can press the letter P on my keyboard. P brings up the separate menu and I can simply separate the selection here. So I'll click on selection and now I have a separate mesh object for my bottom half. I'm still in edit mode of the top half. So I'll press Tab on my keyboard or use the mode menu. So now I have a mesh object there. I'll go ahead and press G on my keyboard and click to move it up. And I have a mesh object here. So two separate mesh objects. Now, because I use that fill option with my bisect tool, you can see the bottom half in my case has that filled big n-gon face there. If I press Tab to go into this mesh objects edit mode, there is in fact an n-gon here. If I press Tab and orbit around, you can see there's a gap or a hole in the mesh. There is no filled side there. That's a pretty easy fix. I'm going to go ahead and just grab that and move it a little bit farther away. If I press Tab to go into edit mode of this top mesh and I use the edge select tool and I hold the Alt key on my keyboard and click on one of the edges around the hole, you can see, hey, it's selected, well, in my case, all of the edges around the hole, and I can simply press the letter F on my keyboard to create a new face or to fill around those edges or in those edges. Okay, so that's the F key to fill, and I'll press Tab to go back into object mode, and now I have two halves I've cut through my mesh. Now, one last thing is, of course, that I have these origins, these little orange dots here and on this mesh object here. And usually origins are in the middle of a mesh unless you specify them to be somewhere else. In my case, I want to move these origins to the middle of the mesh because when you use one of the transform tools, the move, rotate, or scale tools, the little handles for those tools, gizmos, they will be coming off of that origin. So this looks a little bit weird. It really should be in the middle of the mesh. So I'm going to select that mesh, go up to the object menu and set origin to geometry. And that will put that little orange dot in the middle of that selected mesh's geometry. So if I click on that, you can see it jumps up to right there. And now my gizmo handles are a little bit easier to understand. I'll select this one, object, set origin to geometry. There we go. So now I have 2 mesh objects out of 1 using the Bisect tool. So that will be it for this video. If you made it to this point in this video, thank you so much for watching. Again, my name is Colin. And of course, if you liked this video or if you learned something in it, please go ahead and click on that like button below this video. It really helps out me and my channel and gets these videos more seen. Of course, if you want to see more videos like this one in Blender or in the Godot game engine, go ahead and click subscribe and that bell icon so you're notified whenever I upload a new tutorial. Check out my Facebook and Instagram pages. In those 2 places, I post sneak peeks and previews of what I'm working on next, and it's where I communicate with all of you the most, except here on YouTube, of course. But that'll be it for this one. Thank you so much again for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.